Okay, I think I'm recording. I think so. I hit record. Hopefully I am. Yes. Okay. So I want to welcome you all to our Digital Promise webinar today. My name is Patty Konstantakis, and I am the Director of Adult Learning at Digital Promise. And we're happy to have a great webinar for you guys today. This one is about a topic that actually I'm not sure how often we really talk about in adult learning, so I'm excited to talk about this, but it's really thinking about learning differences and how we can use universal design for learning with adult learners, because as we all know, amongst our learner population, there are lots of different kinds. People come to a learning experience with lots of different experiences, lots of different kinds of learning difference is probably the right way to put that. So we have with us today to talk on this topic, we have Jason Marshall, who is the Director of Education at Youth Build USA. And then we have Joe Foreman, who is a teaching fellow for Youth Build USA. And Youth Build USA has been actually really working with UDL and their teachers and their youth that they work with. And so we really wanted to have them talk about what they're doing and how this whole thing is going with them. So I am going to, just a couple of quick logistics before I hand this over to Jason. In most cases, people are kind of...
Lunch is here.
So ideally, you would mute yourself if you can, or I can just because as you come on, there's lots of different kinds of things. It can be kind of distracting to the speakers. Thank you. And what we'll do is, if you'd like to, as they go along and there are questions, they'll kind of pause and ask for questions, but you can do the questions right in the chat window here. Yep, somebody is already discovered the chat. Thank you. So we can do questions in there, or also we're going to probably be a relatively small group. So if there's a question, go ahead and unmute and feel free to go ahead and, interrupt and ask a question or whatever. That's totally allowed in this. And I'll kind of facilitate some of that too. So you can also just type them in the group chat and when we get to it, we'll come back. So without further ado, let me hand this over to Jason. Whoops. I stopped sharing mine in there. Jason, you can share your screen.
All right, let me. Sorry, bear with me. I think, where is it? Here we go.
Technology. Often get the better of us.
Do we have it? All right.
Yeah.
Yes, I think we got it. So thank you, Patty. I appreciate it. So hello, everyone who dialed in, or for folks who are able to listen to this recording later. Appreciate the space to talk to you a little bit about the work that Youth Build USA is doing around learning differences, and in particular, universal design for learning. As Patty said, my name is Jason Marshall, Director of Education at the headquarters of Youth Build USA in Somerville, Massachusetts. And I'm happy to be here with my wonderful colleague, Joe Foreman, who will introduce herself and speak to a little bit later on this webinar. She is a former teaching fellow and currently one of our Universal Design for Learning coaches. So we're both excited to be able to share the work that we've been doing over the last year plus around learning differences and universal design for learning. Just really quick in terms of the flow. So Joe and I have a lot of information to share, and again, it's exciting because we've been, so deep in the work over the last year plus. It's really good to be able to speak to folks outside of the typical Youth Build network about what we've been doing. So our plan is to really talk as freely as possible. I know we have a hard stop of about 1 o'clock. We want to set aside dedicate some time at the end, around 15 minutes or so for questions. But as Patty referenced, it's probably going to be a smaller group. So if anybody has questions while either myself or Joe are sharing, feel free to interject. And we want to kind of, talk about macro level. I'm going to start in talking about a little bit about the Youth Build Network, what garnered our interest in learning differences in UDL, and how that impacts some of the specific initiatives like teaching fellows. And Joe will talk a little bit more about breaking down some of the concepts of universal design for learning and speak to her experience as a teaching fellow being exposed to universal design for learning and how it impacted her classroom and even work that she's doing today. So before I begin formally, I want to do some thank yous. One to Digital Promise with Suzanne and Patty for inviting us today. Really appreciate that. Also want to thank our former Senior Vice President here at Youth Build USA, who's currently Executive Director at Youth Build Philadelphia, Scott Emmerich, who really led this charge around learning differences and universal design for learning, and brought us into partnership with organizations such as CAST, based in Wakefield, Massachusetts, who's leading some of this UDL work and learning differences. I also want to shout out my teaching fellows, 2015 and 16 cohort. That's what Joe was a part of, and our current 2016 and 17 cohort. Really passionate, dedicated educators doing some great work with Opportunity Youth across the country. A specific shout out to teaching fellow coaches, David Flores and Connie Rivera, two former Youth Build instructors, now coaches, work with me to really lead the Teaching Fellows Initiative. I want to thank CAST, in particular Kasha Derpazewski and Allison Posey, who have worked very closely with our teaching fellows at our retreats throughout the last year plus. Really responsible for really grounding us in these principles and seeing how it can be impactful in our classroom design and our classroom practice. And again, thank you for the audience folks who are currently live and will listen later on. So let me begin. Just a little background. I don't know that everybody is aware of Youth Build, the Youth Build organization. So really quickly, this first slide is speaking to kind of like our presence domestically. So Youth Build is around 40 years old. It was started by Dorothy Stoneman, our former CEO. She just stepped down this summer. It's about a 40-year-old organization that was started. One Youth Build started in Harlem, New York. And the purpose was really birthed from the civil rights movement, trying to find a space to give young people agency to have a voice in their community and actual move toward liberation and access to education and those type of things. So really birthed out of the civil rights movement. Every Youth Build program, there are about 200 plus across the country. We have around 20 or 21 internationally. Domestically, every Youth Build program has three main components. One is the education piece, where every young person has the opportunity to get their high school equivalence certification, also known as the GED. There is a vocational training, and Youth Build historically has been known for doing a lot of vocational training around construction, so that young people learn the trade of construction and are able to design and build low-income and affordable housing within their respective communities. There are other vocational tracks as well, but it's really started with construction, and that's the most popular vocational track. And the last piece is graduate leadership development, really educating and training young people to be able to have a critical analysis of their worlds, where they live and nationally, and be able to go back into their communities and change lives in a lot of specific ways around advocating for funding for schools, advocating for things like free housing or fresh food. So those are the three main components of Youth Build, just to give you a macro level understanding. But there is a question of, why is Youth Build USA? So the headquarters of Youth Build is in Somerville, and my role as a director of education is provide technical assistance to the education departments at Youth Builds nationally. And that comes in the form of professional development opportunities like a teaching fellows that will speak to, convening conferences around post-secondary education and access, conferences around learning differences or universal design for learning. So I want to speak to, let me pause for a little bit because I just said a lot, but I want to really speak to what was the interest Youth Build USA in terms of learning differences. Some of you may have seen the blog that I was able to work on with Scott Emmerich that Suzanne and Patty sent out to a lot of people that speaks to why UDL and Opportunity Youth. So just a little background. So the majority of young people that pass through youth build programs are considered opportunity youth. And I want to define that for not assuming everybody is as familiar with that term and knows what it is. So, you know, it's really that opportunity youth is speaking to 16 to 24-year-old low-income youth across the country who typically have lack of resources in their communities, which can impact not only the way they're fed, not only the way they're educated, but what type of opportunities are presented to them. Typically, this population in the educational context are in under-resourced schools, may be overcrowded. Typically, they may be passed through grades instead of actually testing to see if for understanding or knowledge. Typically, they're also misdiagnosed with labels. And a lot of times, those can really just be chalked up to a different type of style in which they learn. We can call that a learning difference. And so this next slide is speaking to just, you know, when I look at this slide, it says learning styles, but, you know, this speaks to me as a different ways in which young people learn. And so there's been a traditional line of thought that, you know, you could take myself, for example, I could come and say to you that, you know, I'm a visual learner or I'm a more kinesthetic learner. And one of the things that we realize is that, you know, everybody has a learning difference, and sometimes there's multiple ways in which somebody like myself may learn it. And some of that depends on the context in which I'm in. Some of that depends on the emotion that I'm bringing to the learning space. So learning differences amongst our population of opportunity youth is huge. Being able to understand that all young people learn differently, and really what does that mean, and for the way that we as educators within the Youth Build Network are designing and constructing our classrooms and working with our young people. So just being able to acknowledge that there are learning differences which are not necessarily a barrier for young people in terms of learning, but an opportunity for us partnering with young people to change the language of how we educate young people and change the classroom experience so that everybody can learn, including the instructors. So again, knowing that we work with this critical population and learning differences is a huge thing with Opportunity Youth. That led us to try to find spaces to convene with other educators and have more constructive discussions around learning differences and what it can mean for the type of work that we try to do together as a collective. So that's kind of the why we were interested in learning differences. Learning differences actually led us to partnerships with CAST through the Oak Foundation, which funded an initiative that would fund a 3-year initiative, which is our Teaching Fellows program I'll talk about, that would bring educators together to be able to, as I mentioned before, speak about learning differences, and in particular, a concept of thinking universal design for learning, which really looks to, it's a framework of thinking that looks to optimize teaching and learning. And it's really based on the scientific research around how humans learn. So I'll talk about it in a little bit, but there's kind of two things that two concepts I'm holding up here. There's first learning differences, understanding that there are different ways in which young people and people in general learn. And then I'll speak to, and Joe will speak to it as well, universal design for learning, which is related to learning differences, but they are different. And that's something within Youth Build USA, in particular with our teaching fellows, that we've had to make that distinction as we went through our practice together. So let me go to this next slide. And so I wanted to speak again a little bit to the why of Opportunity Youth. And so what I just mentioned before, mentioned learning differences and mentioned that universal design for learning is a framework of thinking that, based on the science of how people learn, tries to optimize the teaching and learning experience. So, you know, the way I look at it is that you're in a classroom setting and you have young people that all learn different. Let's say you have 15 young people, and traditionally folks have called it differentiated instruction. So if Jo is in her classroom at her Youth Build program and she has 15 young people, they all learn differently. She's lessons, imagine if there's 15 different learning styles, she's designing lessons 15 different ways for 15 different young people, which can be done and is done, but it's also a lot of work. And so what UDL has really brought to us is it's taking into account how do we design the classroom, the way that we think about the classroom environment, how we design our lessons in a way that we're already anticipating that there's going to be a myriad of learning differences in the classroom. So how do we design our instruction in the learning environment so that it's taken into account everybody's learning difference, keeping the goal consistent for every young person in the class, but allowing flexibility for them to get there. And so why UDL and Opportunity Youth? We know that three of the things that I'll speak to that made UDL very attractive is one, it speaks to the science of how people learn is what I mentioned. The fact that all young people learn differently. So there's a variation in terms of how people learn. UDL also speaks to the emotion of how young people learn and how that impacts the learning space. So the emotion that young people bring to the table, especially Opportunity Youth, who I mentioned before, may have come from lower socioeconomic areas, which you don't want to assume anything about that, but one of the things we do know, especially in the educative space, is that there could be a lot of dysfunction or educational traumatic experience that they've had in the educational space. And so when they're coming into a classroom, emotion does play a part. So context is huge. And so that's one thing about UDL that really spoke to us with the population of young people that we work with. The last piece I'll also mention is Universal Design for Learning sets a firm goal for all young people, but it allows flexibility for them to get there. So that's just kind of like a broad, those are some of the carrots that really attracted us to UDL and why we think it's important to, especially with Opportunity Youth. I think in the blog post, one of the things we mentioned is that UDL really values what young people are bringing to the learning space, kind of where they've been up to that point, where they can go if the learning environment is appropriate, and just valuing their experiences in that learning space is one of the things that I think Universal Design for Learning in particular speaks to with the population of Opportunity Youth. So this slide that I have up here that I've had for a few minutes and haven't delved into really speaks to, now I'm going to kind of move into some specific initiatives that we've had at Youth Build USA that integrate Universal Design for Learning. So this is speaking to our Teaching Fellows mission for 2016 and 17. And I'd say this was also the mission last year, really looking to, as a Youth Build movement, developing engaging instruction and support with students and learning while preparing post-secondary education and careers. So that's the overall mission of the Teaching Fellows. How that program works is that I mentioned that we have 200 plus Youth Build affiliates all over the country. This is a program where instructors, classroom instructors and vocational instructors, or it could be case managers or transition coordinators, anybody that's affecting the educational space for the young person in the Youth Build program can apply. We accept up to 11 to 12 teaching fellows, and it's an intensive year-long professional development opportunity where they are grounded in concept of learning differences and universal design for learning. And they come together as a community twice a year in person at a winter retreat and a summer retreat. And we also have other spaces in which assignments that they're actually responsible for that will integrate learning differences and in particular universal design for learning. This current cohort 2016 and 17 is the 7th cohort that we've had. As you see on this slide, you see a couple of pictures of former fellows at winter retreats. We typically try to have them, so we have one in January in a warm space. The past few years we've been in Fort Lauderdale, Florida. If you see that picture on the left, the woman with blonde hair on the left, that's Connie Rivera, who's one of our teaching fellow coaches and a former Youth Build instructor at a Youth Build program in Hartford, Connecticut. So this is just a brief history, a rich history of the Teaching Fellows program. This is a picture of last year's cohort. You see on the left the two devastatingly good-looking people, Jason and Joe. I'm just kidding about that. But that's our Teaching Fellow cohort from 2015 and 16. And so this is our retreat in Florida. The woman on the left in a black shirt. Folks on this webinar from CAS may recognize Kasha, who I had shouted out before, along with Allison Posey, who is a consultant with us with our Teaching Fellows. And we do get cool Teaching Fellow t-shirts. But we are very intentional with the teaching fellows about, first, I want to hold up learning differences because that's tangential related to UDL. This slide is speaking to the second bullet, how we intentionally integrate UDL into our training and our agenda. So this first retreat in January, one of the big pieces is getting really grounded in universal design for learning principles. But before that, I don't have the slide here, but before we actually even get into this winter retreat, one of the things I did mention in the blog post is that fellows start the teaching fellowship program in October. And one of the first things we do is we enroll in an online massive open on MOOC is the acronym. Folks are probably familiar with MOOC. We do it through North Carolina State, Friday Learning Institute, if I'm saying it correctly. And it's a 12-week course on learning differences. And it really grounds us in the language of the different types of learning differences that young people bring to the table. And I think it's a very interesting course because we are able to have conversation. We study 6 units, and after every unit we have conference calls and guiding questions to facilitate our discussions. And I think it's really informative for instructors because sometimes you actually have, you don't really use a language of learning differences, but through your experience with young people, you've seen these things. And so it really is a great learning opportunity for educators to come together and see that the different learning differences you're seeing through the MOOC are things that you've actually experienced. You just didn't have a language for it. So I think being able to name different learning differences, some of the things we study are like executive functioning and what that means for a young person in terms of how they process information, which informs how they hear the information presented, how do they organize it in their head, which informs kind of the quality of work that they can do. And so we do that 12-week online MOOC again, which is really speaking to learning differences. And that's key because I think understanding learning differences and how UDL speaks to that are two really important things. So as I mentioned in the beginning, we're very intentional within our teaching fellows, and Joe probably remember this, really saying this is learning differences, but this is how UDL speaks to it. So they're not the same thing. And I do remember last year, to be honest, there were some of us, including myself, as I was learning a lot of this, trying to figure out what the difference was. And so a really key piece that we learned is, again, differentiating how the two are similar, but how they're actually different. So UDL is great in that it's assuming that everybody's coming to the learning space with the learning differences, and really how do you design the environment for that and make it accessible for all with a clear goal, but a flexible way to get there. So that's our winter retreat. Before Joe speaks a little bit more about UDL concepts and her experience, this slide is really speaking to the phases of work that we do with our Teaching Fellows program. It's a unique initiative because it's the only one that we have, I'd say, that really allows for a small cohort to work together for an entire year very intensively. We start in October and we're working together consistently until August. So this really quickly, I'll go over the phases of work. I had mentioned that we typically pick the cohort in October and we start conversations. November, as you see here, is when we actually start the online MOOC. And so November in phase 1 in June, you see down below number 1, that's where we're really getting steeped in the learning differences and UDL approaches. And the other piece that Joe will speak to is we also look to implement these, we look to implement it in the classroom. So our goal is not to just get a conceptual knowledge of these things and share best practices with each other, but through the retreats, through our conference calls and smaller coaching groups that we have within the year, our goal is to see how it's going to implement our classroom, whether it's through our design and our lesson plans and ultimately teaching a lesson to the young people. So the first phase, November through June, is really covering that. June through August, our goal is for the teaching fellows to take what they've learned with learning differences in UDL and go back to their programs and try to impact the learning environment at their programs. And so we also get support. They get support from their directors at their individual programs, knowing that this is not just conceptual stuff or a one-off PD experience where you learn it and then you just are away from it. Our goal is to have it go back and implement their respective youth build programs. And so after our June retreat, you see here June through August, this current cohort, their goal is to be able to go back and do, whether it's in the form of presentations or bringing it up at staff meetings, working with other teachers or anybody connected to the education space, like educating them about what UDL is and how not only could it impact the classroom, but impact how it is that that youth build program is educating their young people. Phase 3 is looking to go from understanding it as an educator to phase 2 to bringing it back to your program. To the last piece is how do we have this reach the larger youth build network with 200 plus youth build sites. And so part of the way we do that is Joe is part of a UDL coaches team. So we have 4 of last year's cohort, 4 of the 12 fellows from last year were selected to be UDL coaches, where they get additional training in universal design for learning concepts, but also learn how is it that you can present this to people outside of your respective program. And so that's in the form of things like this, like a webinar. It's with in-person trainings as well. Joe will be going to Camden in a couple of months to do a training with a youth build program in Camden. We have some of our UDL coaches that are not on this webinar who are also working with some of our Department of Labor funded youth build sites as well, whether it's through conference calls, webinars, and actually in-person trainings. So ultimately our goal is to spread it to the larger youth build network because it's rich information and I think very relevant for the opportunity youth that we work with. So I've kind of given you like a macro level, spoke a little bit about our interest in learning differences with youth build, opportunity youth, why we think UDL is important, and in particularly speaking to our initiative with the teaching fellows that really integrates UDL. So I will pause for a second if anybody has any direct questions for me, and kind of queue up again my wonderful colleague Joe Foreman to talk a little bit more about universal design for learning, like specific guidelines behind it, and also speak to her experience as a teaching fellow learning about UDL and integrating it into her practice. So Joe, I will hand it off to you. And
Okay, thanks, Jason. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. So hi, everybody. When I was first introduced to UDL in the winter retreat with the teacher fellows, I was really blown away by this new way of looking at differentiated instruction. It wasn't like this person has ADD, so we're going to do this for this person, or this person has dyslexia, we're going to do something for that person. It's really, as Jason said, the understanding that everybody has learning differences. And so you want to be tight on your goals. You want to, have the rigor of your curriculum. You want to maintain your academic performance standards, but what you want to seek out are ways to be flexible on the means of getting there, because you have, as he said, 15 different people with 15 different ways of learning. And so the great metaphor that they use, that CAST uses when they talk about us, are wheelchair ramps. Wheelchair ramps were designed to make it easier for people with wheelchairs to get up curbs, but people use them for all kinds of reasons. People, moms with strollers, people who are carrying rolling luggage, people who have delivery carts. So it's something that came out of meeting a need of somebody with a certain challenge, but it can help everybody. So it means that something that you might do in your class for a kinesthetic learner, somebody who really needs to move around when they learn, could also benefit other people. They might not have thought of learning in that particular way. And so it just makes the experience so much richer. And so that was very exciting for me, that you keep your goals, but you're flexible on means. And they have 3, the next slide, that would be good. So they have, CAST divides the approach into 3 things. There's engagement, and you don't have to change for this one, but engagement's the first one. Representation, which is how students get information is the second. And then action and expression, how people let you know what they've learned, that's the third. And before I became a teacher fellow, in my practice as an educator, I had intuitively felt the third phase of UDL, that students didn't necessarily have to always write essays in order to prove what they learned, and that if I could think of a variety of interesting and creative ways that students could show me what they learned, and I was an English teacher, then it might be fun for them, and it just makes it a little bit more interesting. So, and they would be a little bit more motivated. So I'll get back to some of the ideas and things that I used when we get to that slide, but I will start talking about this engagement. There's a question, just curious. Oh, what's that question? It went away.
And so it's just curious, are teachers coaches using UDL instructional practices mostly in the classroom portion of the youth build experience, or does it also spill over into the vocational or job learning?
They're using it in all phases. I had two educators from the construction thing on my coaching team when I was a teacher fellow. They have the advantage of having a real, when you're teaching construction, it's easier to have students move around because they have to move around the construction site. It's easier to have hands-on learning, but they are using it in other ways of in their instruction. I just know from talking to those two people that they were trying to implement that in the construction side also.
I can mention something really quick before you go on, Jill. So Patty, I think I mentioned it really quick earlier, but we're very intentional within the teaching fellows of, so it's kind of like a misnomer. We say teacher fellows, but when we think of teacher in youth build, we're thinking of anybody connected to the education space again. So it can be, we have career specialists, transition coordinators, case managers, that vocational trainers. So again, it's not just a formal classroom teacher as we've traditionally thought of it. And so I think another carrot with UDL is it's something that can be implemented and utilized in a lot of different spaces where people are learning, like the vocational or construction space. So, and again, Joe has firsthand knowledge because in our coaching group, there were two construction trainers in there. So, all right, go on, Joe.
Okay, so engagement. I also think of this as, it says for purposeful motivated learners. If students aren't engaged, if they don't want to learn, they're not going to learn. And as Jason mentioned, our youth build students have had not for the most part positive experiences in the schools. I just want to detour a little bit. Something that absolutely broke my heart one day was a conversation between two of my students, and one of them said, did anybody ever call you pathetic? And the other one said, oh yeah, my teacher all the time was saying, oh, you're pathetic. And I'm listening to this, and these two young men went to two different public schools, and I'm thinking, how could there be two teachers out there that are saying that to their students? You talk about labeling, it was just horrible for me to hear. So that's why UDL is really important for youth build students in particular, because they haven't had successful positive experiences in public school. So one of the things I did after learning about UDL, I was teaching English language arts and social studies, and preparing students to take the high school equivalency test in Massachusetts. There was no set curriculum. So I said, well, why not ask the students what they want to learn about? So I asked them to make lists of topics that they were interested in learning about. And I looked online. I also have, just generally online, surfing the web, but I also have online subscriptions to the Boston Globe, and to the New York Times and to the New Yorker. And I found articles to bring in for them to read. So we didn't have a textbook. They read the things that they were interested in learning about. And they shared those interests. So if somebody was interested in learning about Area 51, which I didn't know about before this, we all read it. It's not like he read the Area 51 thing and somebody else read about slaves who had fought back. Once I chose a reading, the whole class read it, and we found many different ways to work with the material. And there was a huge boost in motivation once I started bringing in these readings. The students, even those who said, I hate to read, were actually looking forward to doing the reading for class. So that was really helpful. Another thing is my classroom was very small and crowded, and students complained, they try to get up to go to the bathroom and they knock into a desk, and they said, and I said, well, look, why don't you arrange the room the way you think it's going to work best? And so they did, and I had two different groups. And one group put the desks in traditional school rows, and that worked for them. And another group did the desks in a U shape, and that worked for them. So that was another example of tapping into empowering them to create the environment that was going to work for them as a way of engaging them and motivating them in the learning. And the other thing that made a really big impression on me from the CAST, one of the CAST workshops Jason and I took in October, was the emotional piece, and how important it is to recognize students' emotions. And one of the things they did during the workshop was they would take the temperature of the room, and they said, how are we feeling? Are we feeling like Elmo? Are we feeling like Eeyore? And depending on the response, the facilitator would, either continue as we were going or make some adjustments. I didn't use the children's characters with my students, but from time to time, I would say, how's it going? How are we doing? Do we need to move around? In order to keep them focused and keep them motivated for learning. Okay, any questions about this phase of UDL? Nope. Okay, next slide. Okay, so this was an area in which that was very new for me, the what of learning, representation, how to bring the information to the students to learn. Because I was an English teacher, it was always reading, okay? So we read a play, we read a poem, we read a novel, whatever it was, it always started with the reading. So when I was in public school and I taught Shakespeare, the students would take turns reading the different parts. We would read the play. We would go over key passages. And then after we finished the play, when they were writing their papers at home, I would show the movie. So I decided to reverse it after learning about UDL, because actually, Shakespeare was meant to be performed. And I wanted to teach my students The Merchant of Venice. So there's a really excellent film version of this with Al Pacino and Jeremy Irons. And I showed it to them. I showed them an act at a time. So I'd show them an act. Then they had books, then we'd go back and look at key passages and discuss it. And they totally got it. They totally, absolutely got it. It didn't have to be, put into modern language or anything. That was Shakespeare's language. But by watching professional actors perform the words, they really understood the play. And the essay assignment at the end was, do you think Shylock is a villain or a victim? And half of the class said villain, and half of the class said victim, which also shows how well they understood the play, because you can support both sides. The play itself is very ambivalent on what kind of person Shylock really is. So that was really exciting for me. Another thing is with my coaching group, as part of the Teacher Fellows, we did a unit on the goal is to have students argue whether or not the recreational use of marijuana in Massachusetts should be legalized, because that was coming up in November for a vote. And, you know, they did research online. They found articles, but I also gave them links to televised debates, generally connected with the Colorado vote on this, televised debates and radio programs, so that they could get different way, you know, they could explore different ways of getting the information. And because of that, and because Youthville Boston at that time did not have enough computers for each person to work individually, I put on a full court press in order to get a portable Chromebook lab, and we finally did it. We finally got it, the funds in order to get this little cart of Chromebooks, so that each person, you know, could just stay in the classroom. And unfortunately, it came just the week before I left, so I didn't have a chance to, you know, get on the audiobooks and some of the other technological resources that would be great for the students. But I know that it's been a big help. So, questions about the representation phase? Any questions? That? No? Okay. So the last one is action and expression. And as I mentioned before, this was actually something that I just on my own had worked on as a teacher. So as I mentioned before, we would always start with the reading, the novel, the text, whatever it was. And but to find different ways in which to show that you understood. One thing, an idea I got from another teacher was a character poster, where the students would, usually it's group work, would create a symbol for the character and then would pull out quotations from the text that they thought were important information about the character, and then put it all together into a paragraph analyzing the character. Another way to show understanding was to say, do a storyboard. And so I used to be in television production, so I got them, you know, templates for a storyboard. And I said, choose the key scenes from what we've read and use the quotation from the text underneath each scene. So that was another way that students could summarize what they had learned. Another thing was to create a game based on the story. A third one was to write a song, you know, or a poem, or, you know, at Youthville, write a rap that shows what you've learned about a certain, you know, certain thing that we've read. Another thing was to act out, to take something that was like a story or a novel and act out a part of it as a scene. I did that in public school, and what was really interesting was when it was for To Kill a Mockingbird, and when the students took a quiz on a section of the book, I noticed that everybody got all of the questions for chapter 4 correct. And I commented on this, and there was a response from the students was, well, we acted it out. So that really not only showed that they understood what was going on, but it reinforced and really made it stick in their minds. Other things were to write like a diary of a character, or to make a scrapbook of a character's life. Actually, when I was student teaching, one girl wrote a piece of music to go along with the book that she had read. And as she recorded the music, and as she was playing it, she explained to the class, you know, this is when this is happening in the book, this is when that's happening in the book. So, you know, there are many, many different ways to help, you know, to get students to show you that they've understood what they've learned, or you know, what gaps they have in their understanding. So that was something that, you know, that I was very much in sync with the UDL guidelines. Any questions about action and expression? Oh, I just want to share one other thing that was really exciting. When one thing was to, when I was teaching public school and we were doing Julius Caesar, so this was a long time ago, and texting hadn't come into play yet, but the high school kids were doing instant messaging. So I said, what I'd like you to do is do an instant message conversation between two characters in Julius Caesar. And two girls did one between Portia, Brutus's wife, and Calpurnia, Caesar's wife. And it was great. I mean, it was funny because they were using, their modern slangy language, but it showed that they completely understood what was going on between the women and between their husbands. And so that's another example. So, today would be a text conversation between two characters to show, and it will show you if they understand what's going on inside of them. Any questions?
I was just thinking that's a great example of the fact that one of the things that the folks from CAST, Allison and Kosh, were really intentional about pointing out is that a lot of times educators are actually doing UDL, like practicing UDL in the classroom, but you don't necessarily know it, right? So it was really cool to be able to, so a lot of the fellows were coming to this space learning about the concept, but they were also, CAST was really intentional about saying, like, these are affirming the things that you're already doing. You just didn't have a language for it, but probably your motivation it was good intentions. So that was really good in terms of what they did. So Joe, when I heard you speak about those examples, like what you did with the young people, instant messaging, an example of you were doing some of these things in the classroom already, and then kind of going through the UDL training, you were able to see, it has a language, it has a larger research base or what have you. So I just wanted to name that.
Right. That brings up something too that we don't have a slide for, but when we took that in-depth workshop in October, they were talking us about the different parts of the brain that are used when somebody's learning something new. And so when you're first starting out, they gave the example of playing hockey. When you're first starting out, so much of your brain is just being used to skate, to operate the stick, to just not fall down. And then as you get better and better, less of your brain is used for just the basics, and you can start thinking about strategy and improving your skills. And so that was, for me, it helped to explain why scaffolding is so important in education. And scaffolding was a big part of my teacher training program, learning how to do that. But it was very exciting to learn why that's necessary, because when you first introduce something to a person, they have to use so much of their bandwidth in order to just try to not fall down. And as they get more and more comfortable with the concepts, then you're able to go deeper and in a more sophisticated way. And, if they're writing, first you just want to get their ideas down, and you don't worry about things like punctuation and style and all that sort of stuff until they've actually got the ideas and the organization. Then, move to polishing it so that it's a really fine piece of writing.
I have a question for you guys. So part of the Fellows program is then to take it back to your to work with your staff and your part of the network, I guess. So how does that go? Like how receptive are others to the whole notion? Are they confused by it for a while, or it's like how does that whole thing go at this point?
Well, I guess I could talk from my experience at Youth Build Boston. Was I facilitated a workshop for the other educators, construction as well as classroom, at Youth Build Boston, and people were interested, but everybody, I mean, the truth is, and there were a couple of people who were interested in applying for the Teacher Fellows program, but they were just so overworked that they couldn't spare the time. So, but it was pretty well received. And then I would have to say that, you know, the management was very supportive of this idea of getting the technology to the students, and trying to find the means for getting that portable computer lab. So I'm sure that they're going to continue to build on that. And then Jason, you have a national view. What are you seeing?
Right. Yeah. I think it's, you know, overall, it's definitely been, people have been hungry for this. And I think one of the things I spoke to earlier is part of what I've learned from the folks at CAST, Allison and Kasha and others, that, you know, one, that UDL is something that's applicable not just to the traditional classroom teacher in the traditional classroom. These concepts and the way that young people learn, opportunity youth, but actually people in general learn, and setting up their learning environment to make it accessible to all is I think that's something that you can apply in a lot of different settings, right? Outside of formal education. So all that to say, I think that's kind of some of the messaging that we do, when I'm speaking to different folks about UDL across the network. And I'm technically also not just speaking about educators. You know, I've met with executive directors, and we have a large charter school, Youth Build charter school in California, and I met with a bunch of their administrators, about 20 or so. And one of the things Joe and I learned in the workshop with CAST in October is different ways that you communicate the concept of UDL depending on the audience, right? So the context. So the way that I may, or Joe may talk about it to instructors is different than the way I may talk about it to some executive directors who are not as close to the classroom space. All that to say, I think there's definitely been a hunger for it, and I think largely because UDL can speak to all learners, but I think knowing, generally speaking with opportunity youth, the gaps in terms of access to post-secondary education, incarceration rates, some of the systemic issues that impact them in the spaces of learning. UDL, again, it's not the panacea by any means, but I do think in a lot of ways, because of the science behind the way people learn and how emotion impacts it, and context and being flexible, you're able to design a more flexible learning environment that makes more young people come into it feeling as if they're acknowledged. Because I think you look at hierarchy of needs, you need to deal with like making them feel secure in the space first. And so what I found is majority, overwhelmingly, there's been positive views about the UDL concept in general. And then you also got to speak about it in a way where you're speaking about it to people and instructors in particular, where it's not adding another thing in the classroom that's not aligned in what they're doing. You really got to talk about it like, how is this going to help the goals that you already have in your classroom as an educator and as a executive director or director? How does this help you to meet your goals and outcomes for your educational programming? So, and I got to give shout out to CAST for doing that, because Joe and I were part of a training that really spoke to like, how do you present UDL to different audiences? And that's one of the really key things that we learned in October. So that's been helpful in terms of spreading the message of UDL.
And I just want to add a personal note that I've taken some of their strategies into my own way of working. So they're big on color coding, as you could, if you remember that each brain had a different color, each of those slides. And so when I was preparing my notes for this, I printed out the slides. I don't have a color printer, but on the representation, I wrote my notes in purple, and on engagement, I wrote my notes in green, and I've actually found it, very helpful in terms of my own work and organizing thoughts. So thank you, CAST.
And we're all still learning. I mean, we're all evolving. Like, Joe and I, where we were a year ago with UDL, we're at a different place now. So by no means do we think we're experts in it, but we've definitely, our thinking on it has evolved in finding different spaces which it can impact the work that we do with our opportunity youth and youth.
Sure. So, and there's another question here in the chat that's talking, like, kind of moves from the teacher to the student outcomes. So are you gathering any data on sort of what you're seeing with students, or like, Yeah.
Yeah.
What's the response there, and what are you starting to see?
So from a macro standpoint, right now it's more anecdotal. So with the teaching fellows that we had last year, Joe included, it's really been more anecdotal as to, the way in which it's impacted the engagement of young people in the classroom, the way they designed it. I do have teaching fellows, thinking of one teaching fellow, Mike Anderson in Omaha, Nebraska, who really, gave anecdotal feedback of how he thought it impacted the classroom setting, but really thought that that was what led to an influx of a spike in the young people in his program that were getting their GED or high school credential. So we don't have like the hard quantitative data, but we definitely have a lot of anecdotal, more qualitative feedback from fellows as to how it's impacted the classroom in a positive way. Really, one thing I want to speak to this last side of, in case folks are wondering, this is just an example of, I talked about that teaching fellows have UDL lesson plans that are kind of have a UDL focus and how they're going to engage young people. And they design those lesson plans and teach them to the young people. And if you see it on the right, you see the recording. We have them record those lesson plans. So Joe was in a small group with myself and two other construction trainers, and they each designed a lesson plan with UDL kind of alignment in mind, implemented it, recorded it, and then within our small groups, we gave each other feedback as to what we saw. So just an example of how we integrate UDL into the teaching fellows and one of the specific projects that they have to do as part of the intensive year-long professional development experience. So.
Great. So 2 more questions, and then I actually think we've got like a minute, and then we got to get off here. But just real quick, someone asked if folks can get access to this UDL training. Is it through CAST maybe, or?
Yeah, CAST. So Joe is a UDL coach, purpose to work with Youth Build affiliates. I would say if they're not a Youth Build program, then CAST would be someone that they get in contact with. I don't know if, Patty, if everybody's gotten in the blog that you guys have sent out a couple weeks back, I think the link for CAST organization is in there. If not, you can just Google CAST or put in, I think it's cast.org, or just Google CAST, all caps, and they're in Wakefield, Massachusetts. And so if you go to the website and get in touch with them, they're very quick to get back in contact with you. I definitely speak highly of Kasha and Allison Posey, who are some of their consultants that work with folks nationwide. So you'd be in good hands if you're working with any of those two.
Yep, great. Well, so on that note, we're right at 10 o'clock, or 1 o'clock, you guys' time. So I want to thank Jason and Joe for this webinar. Very, very interesting stuff you guys are doing. This webinar will be recorded. We will post it up on our website also. So, and I will actually send out to all the attendees and anybody who registered, I'll send up a follow-up email that has a link to the webinar so you could share it, and then also have Joe and Jason's contact information and a link to CAST so that folks can get back here. And then we'll also sort of spread this webinar. It's great information. Thank you guys for being here, and thanks to the rest of you for attending today.
Thanks for inviting us.
Okay.
All right. Thank you guys. Bye.
All right.